is Investment Summit Online, sponsored by Xsolar. Our next talk is entitled, Is Your Indie Game Viable? How to Research the Market? And it's presented by the CEO and co-founder of Wings, Cassia Curran. I'll be back at the end of this session with any questions that you may have. Ask them in the chat bit of YouTube. Until then, over to you, Cassia.
Hi, everyone. Okay, let me just pull up my PowerPoint. Oh, there you go. Nope. Share screen. I think I've done it, maybe. Okay, there you are. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk on the indie game market and how to work if your indie game idea is ever going to get any funding. I wanted to give this talk because as an investor in games, we're constantly having indie game developers coming to us with some really interesting, really cool games that we can't invest in, because once you've carried out a market analysis and you've crunched numbers, you realize that as an investor, if you make this investment, you're never going to make a profit. So yeah, how do we avoid that situation? So boiled down to its complete simplest, working out whether your indie game is viable is a matter of comparing how much it costs to make to how much revenues it will return. So this talk doesn't actually cover how much it costs to make. It doesn't cover talking about how to work out your budget. But we are going to talk about how to work out how much revenues it's going to return. So market analysis, essentially. And whilst market analysis sounds dull, it's actually a really interesting, really fun exercise that can give you a really very, very valuable insight into games. So market analysis, when it comes to indie games, it just means find a bunch of games roughly similar to yours. Then you work out how much money they made. Then you play all the games, you analyze everything about them, you try and work out all the reasons for why there's a difference in sales in your competitor set. And then from the insights that you get from this exercise, you work out how much money that your game idea is likely to make. And then, yeah, you make sure that the budget of your game is a lot less than the sales you're likely to get, the sales projection that you just calculated. So talking a little bit about how to create a competitor set, how to find similar games. I presume that if you're making, for example, a racing game, then you know racing games, so you've played a lot of racing games, but it's always good to check through all the racing games that have come out, especially in the last year or two. You should focus on the most recent releases because markets move quite fast in the indie games industry. And you shouldn't just be looking at the top sellers. Don't be just looking at the outlying, massively successful games in your genre or that are similar to you in some way. You want to be looking at every single game that is somewhat within your genre. Oh, well, every single one, it might be impossible, but the more the better. The more data that you have, the more data that you develop, the more accurate and valuable the insights you will therefore get. If your game is actually, in your opinion, completely different from everything on the market and it's super innovative, in which case, well done you. I suggest then thinking about the kind of player that would like your game, and then using a competitor set which is based upon what other games that player might like. So, for example, if you think that the kind of players that would really like your game are super competitive and or really into multiplayer, then you're looking at the super competitive multiplayer games, even if they have very different gameplay. That's one way of approaching it. The next bit is the hardest part. So you're kind of trying to work out what kind of revenues all these different games have made. And to be honest, on PC and console, we are pretty limited for accurate data, especially because there's so many different platforms and they're pretty fragmented. But your aim, therefore, for revenue calculations isn't one complete accuracy here. You're looking for ballpark numbers. So you're looking for having an error margin of 50%, but not an error margin of like 10,000%. A secret for you is that everyone, including extremely large companies in the PC and console gaming, when they're making analyses, market analyses, so many of them have used Steam Spy. It's true. But unfortunately, at the moment, Steam Spy is somewhat broken right now. It still can be worth using or looking at as a secondary data point. What I think is worth trying right now is an updated box lighter method that's been updated by Jake Burkett. That theory is that roughly 1 in every 30 to 1 every 150 players of a game that they bought tend to leave a review on Steam. So that means if there are 10 reviews of a game on Steam, they've maybe sold about 300 to 1,500 copies on Steam. If there's 100,000 reviews of a game on Steam, then maybe it's 3 to 15 million. So you can get ballparks. And if you take the center of that ballpark, then you can at least get some sort of relational idea about the spread of the games that you're looking at your competitor set. And then to work out the gross revenues on Steam, it's obviously you just multiply the estimated unit sales number by the price that is there. But then actually getting that number accurate to net revenues is a lot more tricky. So it gets very, very messy. So you have Steam, which for sales under $10 million of any game will take 30% of revenues. Then yes, you'll probably multiply it by US price, but then there's all these other regional prices. So if you look at Steam database, that is a good resource for looking at what discounts or what other prices there are in different countries, because sometimes it can be a lot cheaper in different countries. There's also the fact that you're always going to get some players returning the game, or they're going to charge it back on their credit card. You're also going to have to bear in mind that it's not going to be, a lot of the sales will not be sold during the time, during full price time. A lot of the sales will be happen during the promotional sales. So you have to look up when those sales are, and that can give you a much better estimate of what the a real price is. So you might want to discount that by like 20%. And yeah, that's a lot. But my sort of, and that's just for Steam, right? So this we can't really work out very easily the sales on other platforms. But my very lazy trick cheat, which works better if you're doing a lot of games rather than just one, is that usually the net revenues on Steam is about half of the gross revenues, and then the total revenues of all the platform on the other platform is about the same. So actually, if you just use the box lighter method and then multiply it by the US price, for example, then that's roughly, very roughly, what it's going to be for total sales on all platforms, including Steam, in my opinion. But the ultimate cheat, frankly, after all this complex maths, is just ask the developer. That's worth a try. There's a lot of indie game developers are super nice, and they will totally let you know if you ask really politely. And I often recommend saying, I think it's about this amount. Do you think, is that correct? And they may or may not verify it for you. That's worth a go. So after that, it's the fun part. So at this point, you get to play all the different games, and you theorize about all the differences for why there's differences in sales, because you will see like a massive spread. And I recommend tracking everything in this spreadsheet, by the way. There are so many factors that will impact the sales of a game, and it varies tremendously depending upon the game genre and the kind of people who play it. It's definitely worth reading a lot of player reviews of these games and like really trying to work out whether those really trying to work out some theories from the player reviews and working out whether they're true or not. But the multiple success factors could be like, particularly like things like the quality of the game is often like very critical. So, and obviously there's a huge amount that goes into whether a game is good or not. And I will leave that up to game developers for your specific genre, finding out what is like the most important thing. For some game genres, for example, it's really important to have beautiful artwork, and some game genres nobody really cares that much. It's more about the moment-to-moment gameplay. But the other factors, just give you like a shotgun list, could be the amount of time. Some players really don't like it when the game is too short, and they will complain and charge it back. There's the game price is always a massive topic. I don't believe that necessarily that if the game has a lower price, more players are likely to buy it. There is a case where players want to play a quality game. How do they know whether this game is quality or not? Well, it costs a bit more, so maybe it's better quality. There's play expectations, though, that can have a really strong impact. So if a player is looking for a very fast-paced competitive game, and then they see like the artwork is kind of cutesy or just doesn't match what they're actually wanting, even if the gameplay is that, they might not just pick up on the fact it's the game that they would enjoy. Marketing, some games, most games will need decent marketing. There's only very few games that sell by word of mouth with zero marketing, and you're extremely lucky if that happens to you. But having a look at the games, whether there was whether the publisher involved, what kind of social media like platforms they had, like activity there, that can give you an idea of what kind of support it had at launch. Looking at the languages, looking at the reviews on Steam and like the numbers of different languages and which what language is the most popular for the reviews in Steam, and maybe some games didn't sell as well because they were slow to be localized in a key language as possible. Obviously checking all the different platforms, checking where they're available. Often it's more platforms, more sales, usually, sometimes. Release schedule, was it released at a time when it's super busy during Christmas? And I think lastly, and really quite importantly, is thinking about the market as a whole. Like how big is that genre, for example? Is there lots and lots of players who love that genre? Is it rather niche? Is it a kind of genre where, is it the kind of market where players are really loyal and they will only play that one game that they really like? Or is it the kind of market where a player buys a game and they love it and they finish it and they're like, I want another game like that, and they buy that game and so on? Looking at whether that market is growing or declining can also be worked out. It's definitely very good if your game does belong to a sort of specific market or specific genre, to try and work out whether there's any trends, whether there's saturation or it's explosion in growth, and try and work it out for 2 years in the future whenever your game is going to release. And yeah, from that you work out the sales projection, and you end up hopefully with being able, through all the insights that you've developed through this rather complex exercise that I've just sped over in like 10 minutes, but you should be able to have a lot of insight into why some games are successful, why some games have failed, and you can guess from your own plans, like rough, like that you might not be able to actually hit the AAA level of a game. You're never going to get their sales, but you could, if you're lucky, get this high selling indie game amount. And if you're unlucky, you could get the sales of this another indie game which is similar to yours, which didn't sell very well, but it's still similar quality. And you can, and then essentially taking these high, medium, and low projections, you then have your working out whether your game is viable. You can see what we often see is that, for example, we'll get like a game that is pitched to us that is asking for millions of dollars, but the similar games to it that have released in the market, or like a recent game, only made like $500,000. So that's impossible to invest in. It's just it's kind of heartbreaking when that happens. But what we frequently try and push, what developers really need to think about is making sure that they have that gap, especially if you're looking for funding. It's not just enough to have your budget be equal to your medium sales projections. There should be a lot less, so that any investors or publishers can get some sort of profit, and so you can get some profit as well. There's a ton of resources available, and so I've just put a lot of them here on the screen. So Dutch Game Garden Guesstimator is a good one that will do a lot of work for you, and a lot of the calculations. And there's lots of people to follow. There are issue with this market analysis is that it does change fast, and platforms change fast, and consumer behavior changes fast. But just the exercise, these different games will educate you so much more, and it's worth doing, even if it's incredibly hard and you'll make lots of mistakes. So thank you very much. That was my lightning fast talk on market analysis.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cassia. That was really interesting, very interesting indeed. And we've had quite a few questions actually following up. So let's have a look. I think we'll go for this first one. It's sort of slightly, because you mentioned at the beginning that if you have a game that is not a kind of typical game type, that it might be difficult to do this kind of analysis. So Johanna's asking, you know, she doesn't want to make it the same game like the ones that are around. So how can she work in that kind of unknown, if you like?
Yeah, that's I think innovation when it comes to sales is super interesting. I have a lot of thoughts about that.
Oh, sorry, could you just come out of the presentation,
yes.
Cassia, and then we can see. That's
is that
great.
Stop share?
That's it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. So you have to remember, first of all, for premium indie games, if you look at it from the eyes of a player, they've got limited amount of time, they've got a limited discretionary income, and buying a new game is always a gamble, and they have thousands of games to choose from. So how do they make the right investment in a way for themselves? What signals do they pick up from the way that the game is presented that will make them believe that it's worth buying? You really have to put yourself in a player's position. And what is most common a way in that a player will decide to buy a game is quite often genre. And it's the fact that they played a game that's pretty similar, and this game is like, they're like, I really enjoy strategy games, and this is a new strategy game, and it looks really cool for this reason, because it's got this kind of awesome twist. There's a bit of a truism that having a new twist on something that is familiar is the best way to create new content. But total respect for game developers who want to do something completely innovative. It's really hard, especially because when it's first of all really hard to innovate like a new game mechanic and make it fun. I do still think that having an understanding of what you're innovating from is a really good idea. Like having a really clear understanding what things you just keep the same because no point in reinventing the wheel, and which areas are you really just like pushing the boat out on, and also why. Like it's great if you're you played loads of different games yourself. You yourself are a particular kind of player, and you have this desire to play something that is just not there, and you want to make that game. That's pretty great. Yeah, so I don't think I quite answered the question when it comes to market analysis, but I did actually mention a bit later that one approach is to think about the players and what kind of games that are not similar to the game that you're innovating, what kind of games they might like, and sort of delve into those and try and understand the players rather than the games a bit more.
Yes, fantastic. Brilliant. Okay. We've got a question here from Cloudy Nebula. Regarding marketing, what kind of strategies would you recommend? Is it better to save some budget for a PR company, for example, or should indie developers think more creatively about promoting their game?
Oh, that really depressingly, the answer is it depends, and it depends on your game, and it depends on the creator as well. I do think that the number one most important marketing decision that you make is actually your game design, for pretty much all the reasons that I just gave in the talk. So making sure that there is like a player base actually there for your game that would enjoy it, and making sure that they can find it. It's worth, if you are able to innovate and do cool things as a developer, I think that is great. I really loved seeing developers really connecting with their audiences. I think that's particularly something that indie developers can do, and creating memes from their own work and having fun online. That can be really a lot more valuable than sometimes with marketing agencies. Sometimes they just have like somewhat of a bit of a set play and not as innovative as you are, and they maybe just don't know your game as well as you do. So it varies. It really varies in developers. Some developers are just like, I can't do this. But I think it's worth getting to know your player base and developing a relationship with them, and building that community.
And I imagine that Wings would have a lot of connections into the industry as well, and be able to make connections and help with promotion and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. We have a whole set of lists of all the different types of providers, agencies, localization, platform holders, anything you can wish. We've especially developed it to help out game developers, and we're constantly helping developers work on their budgets and making it more realistic, or improving it in terms of making sure they're not overspending on things that they don't need.
Yeah. Exactly. A question from Corundum Games. What are some signs you're overthinking your analysis? That was directed
probably
at you
when you stop
personally,
having fun, I would actually say. Yeah, honestly, the market analysis bit, like, it should be like one of the most fun things about your of the process of developing a game. Is if you love the game that you're making, and you should, then you probably love, like, thinking about ways to make it better, and market analysis is largely about that.
Yeah, brilliant. I think we've got time for like one more question. So I'm going to ask Cloudy Nebula says, when calculating a projection of sales, would you factor in approximate value for sales and discounts and separate it from the full price projection, or just a bulk average is enough?
It depends on how, I would say, I would go the extra mile for a game that was really important for me in terms of like, say if it was like a game where you're going like, okay, so this is a game which is I'm going to almost partly mark it off, like as say, oh, it's kind of like a papers please, blah blah blah. And I would really try to work out what papers please is the revenue as well. But if it's somewhat more dissimilar, then I would take probably the easier option.
Yeah, easier all the time. Yeah.
And
Great.
what you can
Well,
also do is, sorry, just very quickly, what you can do
sure.
is just do a very much a general calculation, making sure that you're up to date with all the platform, little bits and bobs and any changes, and then the independent developers, you know that you've made those games, like getting a few verified points can then really help you have belief in the calculations that you made.
Brilliant. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you again, Cassia. That was really interesting, and I'm sure very useful for a lot of our developers who are watching. And you'll be back as well a bit later on at 6 p.m. On our panel as well.
Right.
How is the pandemic changing investment? So we've heard a bit about the pandemic today, but that's a panel concentrating on that particular issue. Our next talk is a pre-recorded session, actually. It's from Alex Nichiporchik from Tiny Build on Indie Publishing is Dead, a talk by an indie publisher. It's at 5:30 p.m. UK time, which is in just a couple of minutes. To get the streaming details, head to investmentsummit.gamesindustry.biz. There you'll get all the links to all the talks, including this one as well. You'll be able to watch again when you like. Thanks again to Cassia, and I'll be back at 6 p.m. to introduce